네, 안녕하십니까? 인적 자원 개발 컨퍼런스 기조강연의 인터뷰를 맡게 된 박유림입니다. 이 자리를 교수님과 함께 하게 되어 매우 영광입니다. 저는 현재 교수님과 같은 옥스퍼드대학교에 재학하고 있습니다. 메디컬 사이언스 전공으로 박사 2년차를 하고 있지만 평소 교수님의 연구에 관심을 가지고 있었고 이번 기회를 통해 더 많은 얘기를 들어보고자 참여하게 되었습니다. 교수님 소개를 간단하게 드리자면 폴 콜리의 교수님은 현 옥스퍼드대학교 블러바트닉 행정대학원의 경제학과 공공정책학 교수이십니다. 하버드 대학교와 파리 정치대학교에서 위원장직을 역임하셨으며 IMF의 전략정책부서, 세계은행 아프리카 지역 분과의 자문을 맡았습니다. 2014년에 기사직위를 받으셨고 2016년에는 영국 학술 원장 표창을 받았습니다. 대표 저서로 약탈당하는 지구와 엑소더스, 알렉산더 베츠와의 공저 난민이 있습니다. 특히 저서 10억의 빈곤층으로 세계 최고의 논픽션이 시상하는 라이오넬 길버상과 민관 비영리 단체인 미국 외교협회에서 수여하는 아서 로스 도서상을 2020년도 출간한 자본주의의 미래로 독일의 유력 경제지 한델스블라트에서 수여하는 한델스블라트상을 받았습니다. 한국에는 2020년 자본주의의 미래, 2014년 엑소더스, 2011년 약탈당하는 지구, 전쟁 총투표, 2010년 빈곤의 경제학 등이 소개되었습니다. 역사적으로 사회는 경쟁과 협력 속에서 부의 축적을 위해서 성장해 왔습니다. 폴 콜리의 교수는 존케이와 2020년 발표한 Greedy Stat에서 극단적인 개인주의가 오늘날 협업을 약화시키고 정치를 양극화시켰다고 이야기하며 사회, 정치 전반에 걸친 상호호혜의 가치를 재확인할 것을 주장합니다. 이 강연에서는 인간의 동기부여와 함께 기업의 방향을 전환하여 하향식 명령, 통제, 인센티브 등에서 공동의 목적을 가지도록 유도하는 방법에 대해서 얘기해 주실 것입니다. 폴 콜리의 교수님이 한국을 초점에 두고 진행한 인터뷰나 강연이 많지 않습니다. 오늘 교수님을 이 자리에 모셔서 다양한 이야기들을 들어보고자 합니다. 자, 그럼 교수님을 모셔보도록 하겠습니다. Good morning, Professor Collier. Thank you for joining us today. How are you?
I'm fine, thank you. Good morning, Yurim. I'm in France, where it is morning, but I take it it's a bit later for you.
I'm indeed in Oxford, so it's morning for me as well.
Oh,
So
okay.
we are very honored to have you with us here today, and I'm very looking forward to your talk. So in your book, The Future of Capitalism, Korea was mentioned in the context that Sheffield lost its competitiveness due to the development of the Korean steel industry. So in the previous Korean generation, there was a time when people simply just worked with pride while increasing their fortunes, which thankfully led to the rapid growth in the Korean society. However, Korea has entered this stagnating economic status, so the current generation is no longer free from some concerns. So people feel a sense of crisis that we may have to give up our position as the leader in the manufacturing industry to other emerging countries. So with a government-led policy to foster large enterprises, which accounts for only 1% of all enterprises in Korea, so those 1% are taking more than 70% of the total profits. There are some still unresolved problems. So 25 million people, or about a half of the total population, living in the metropolitan area where jobs are concentrated. There are other problems like conflicts between the younger generation and the older generation, deepening feelings of isolation for individuals, declining birth rate, and division with North Korea. So as you said in your book, I think many people are thinking about how to rebuild our community while the elites are becoming more and more selfish and individual ideas are becoming more and more diverse. So, what would you like to say to Korean attendees? These Korean people are waiting to hear your insights and expertise in the issue. Now the floor is yours when you're ready.
Thanks very much, Yurim. You know, quite a lot of the high-income societies like South Korea are facing similar anxieties. And that's indeed what the book, The Future of Capitalism, was about. And in the end, that book is a hopeful message that it's possible to do something about. And so I'm excited to talk to a South Korean audience because I think that South Korea is actually in a much better state than most high-income societies. You are an extraordinary society. In many ways, you're a crucible of modernity, a very vibrant culture, a very active democracy, some very, very impressive large organizations, your firms, but also an awful lot of small firms, small businesses. So there's some very good things about South Korea, very good indeed. And you just have to look at the culture to see what an innovative society it is. So there's a lot that's going right. And that's demonstrated very recently by the way that South Korea managed to tackle COVID. It's really been the most impressive approach to COVID of pretty well any country in the world. And so you've a lot to be proud of. And you've got a lot of reasons to look confidently forward at the future. But at the moment, young people in South Korea are not looking confidently forward to the future. And that is a tragedy because the future promises with new technologies to be very much more prosperous than the past and the present. But young people, especially people in their 20s, are showing deep signs of anxiety about the future. And the most obvious feature of that is the low birth rate. Young people are not sufficiently confident to have children. Now, who's going to solve that problem? Is it going to be South Korea's politicians, or is it going to be South Korea's businesses? And I'm going to first suggest why it's going to be businesses, not politicians. And unfortunately, we see across the Western world, when young people have fewer children, there are fewer people with children who have votes, and more old people who do have votes. And so in an aging society, the politicians have a stronger and stronger incentive to cater for the old, not the young. But firms are different. Firms' problems are to recruit young workers. It's the young workers who, as I'll argue, have the dynamism, the innovation. They are literally the people on whom the future of the firm will depend. And so it's very important for South Korean firms to run themselves in a way that enables young people to be confident about the future. And who shapes those firms? It's the human resource departments. And that's why I'm so excited to be addressing so many people working their careers in human resources across South Korea. It's a really strategically important audience. And so I want to try and apply the ideas that I put out in The Future of Capitalism. And there were really two big ideas. And I'll try and apply those to the decisions that have to be taken in human resource departments. And I'm going to look at 4 types of decision. One is, who do you headhunt as your chief executive? Another is, who gets promoted? What criteria should you use for promotion? The third is, how best do you reward people? Your pay structures. And finally, how best do you recruit people? What should you be looking for, and how should you pitch yourselves so as to be attractive to the people you want? So that's the agenda. And let's get started with 2 big ideas that were very, very influential in the world over the last 30 years and swept through human resource departments. And I'm going to argue that they're both very bad ideas, which have now been discredited. But they've only recently been discredited. And my book, The Future of Capitalism, was part of that process, but there's actually an awful lot of research now which does discredit these 2 big bad ideas. And so you don't just have to depend on me. There's a tidal wave of modern research books, some of which I'll refer to as we go along. So what was the first really big bad idea that swept across human resource departments around the world? It actually swept across business schools. And that first idea was an idea about human nature. It's about what sort of animals humans were. Yeah? And these ideas first emerged in the 1950s and then got picked up by economics and built into the models that economics built in the 1960s. And then by the 1970s, they started to be taught in business schools. And by the 1990s, those students in business schools had risen so they were important in companies. And so it's a long process from some really bad ideas in the 1950s through to enormous damage being done to companies from the 1990s. So what was this big bad idea about human nature? It was a very simplified view of Darwinian evolution. And the cliche phrase about Darwin is the survival of the fittest. And so the crudest form of Darwinism in the 1950s said, oh, there's only one sort of person who's evolved to survive, and that is people who are greedy, selfish, and lazy. Yeah? So the only reason they work is because they're hungry themselves, and they're purely selfish, because if they weren't purely selfish, they wouldn't have survived. The selfish survived at the expense of the people who weren't selfish. And the greedy survived because they're the first to grab the food. Right? So greedy, selfish, lazy. Right? Don't do anything other than what's necessary for yourself and your greed. Right? Now, if that's what human beings are like, then if you're an employer, you've got a real problem. How on earth do you get people who are greedy, lazy, and selfish to do any work? Because they don't want to. Right? And the answer came up as, well, you've got to watch them like a hawk. So intense scrutiny, monitoring, measure what they're doing, and then give them incentives. I'm going to call that cat food. Right? And I call it cat food because actually greedy, selfish and lazy is a pretty good description of a cat. I've got two cats, and they're both extremely greedy, extremely selfish, and extremely lazy. They just lay about all day. And the only reason they get up is when you put some cat food down. So economics inadvertently built a really good model of a cat. Economics like to give Latin names to things, so it called economic man Homo economicus. But actually, it was a very good model of a cat. So I think of the economic models as describing catus economicus. Right? Now, that turns out to, first of all, it very strongly influenced how human resource departments ran things, scrutinize, monitor, and link to incentives. Right? So that was the design structure. And economics dressed that up in a whole fancy bunch of theories called principal agent theory. People got Nobel Prizes for it and that sort of thing. But it was all based on this view of human nature, a very bleak view of human nature. Now we turn to reality. And reality comes not from me, it comes from the cutting edge research on evolutionary biology. And so I'm going to refer to two big blocks of research, one who's head of department at the evolutionary biology department in Harvard. That's a guy called Joseph Heinrich. And the other is his counterpart, who's head of evolutionary biology at Yale. And that's called Nicholas Christakis. So these people are not eccentric idiots. They're head of two of the leading research departments on evolutionary biology in the world. And they both say the same thing. They've both written very good, very readable recent books. If you want to read one book by Heinrich, there's a book called The Secret of Our Success. One book by Nicholas Christakis, it's called Blueprint. Came out a couple of years ago. So these are recent books, recent research, but it's very rigorous. And what it tells us is humans are a very unusual type of mammal. We're very, very pro-social. And there's a simple evolutionary reason for that. When apes came down from the trees and became humans, they were living very dangerously. They were on the savannah, and my goodness, the savannah was dangerous for a naked ape. We weren't that fast, we weren't that fierce, we didn't have claws, and so we were really in danger. And the only way we survived was to learn to cooperate. And so the people who didn't survive were the people who couldn't cooperate. So far from the greedy, lazy, and selfish surviving, they almost became extinct. They survive as only 3% of human beings, and they're called sociopaths, people who can't get on with other people. Right? So what the other 97% of us are is these very unusual mammals who are hardwired, have evolved to cooperate with each other. And the big way we cooperate is by reciprocity, mutual agreeing to obligations. I'll do this for you if you do this for me. And so we're designed to work in quite big teams that cooperate. Right? That's how we survived. And so for 200,000 years, that's been the distinctive feature of human beings. We're very good at cooperating, and we're very good at learning from each other. How does cooperation work? It works by what we really are keen to get is the good opinion, the esteem of our colleagues, of our peers in a team. We want them to respect us and see us as a valued member of the team. We want that good opinion, and we're willing to set aside our own wants for that esteem from our peers. So that's the really powerful force that motivates people. We're motivated by a quest for the esteem of the people we feel we belong to in a group. So we belong to groups and we value the opinion of other people in that group. And a firm, of course, builds, a good firm builds teams of people who then cooperate. Now, not only that, we're also very distinctive in having purposes beyond just me now. Right? We have evolved so that we try to look to the future. So we want to leave a legacy for at least for the next generation. And we want something that is larger than just ourselves. So we want to get the good opinion of other people. We want to make a difference to our world. Right? And so that is, we're not saints. We're still, after all, we're mammals, but we're a very unusual mammal. Now, suppose that you treat this very unusual mammal as if they were a cat, as if they were just greedy, lazy, and selfish. What you do is you drag people down into habits which just really turn us into cats. We're these very unusual mammals, but we are a mammal. Somewhere inside us, there's an element which is greedy, lazy, and selfish. So we can always be dragged down, and a badly run company does that. It drags people down to the worst features of their nature. And let me give you an example of a really badly run company. It was called Bear Stearns, and you might not have heard of it because it was the first of the investment banks, the New York investment banks. It was the first to go bankrupt. It actually triggered the whole global financial crisis. Right? Now, Bear Stearns had a mission statement in its entrance lobby. And that mission statement said, "We make nothing but money." Now, just think, that's your mission statement. Who are you going to recruit? Who is going to apply to a firm with a mission statement like that? Well, it turned out who applied, it was people who said, we make nothing but money for ourselves. Right? And they discovered, so Bear Stearns had plenty of incentives, gave bonuses. Go and get a deal. Go and get a deal and we give you a bonus. And so the employees discovered that there was a very easy way to game the incentive system. And so they did deals which were dangerous deals. But once they were signed, the deals would be all right for a year or so, and then you get your bonus. After that, they were so dangerous that they blew up. And so Bear Stearns went bankrupt because its employees blew it up. They did deals which were so dangerous that they bankrupted the firm. Right? That's what you get if you run a firm where you drag people into being greedy, lazy, and selfish. Some of the American drugs companies have done exactly the same thing and are now bankrupt for the same reason. Right? They disgraced the company, and so the company became worthless. Right? So if you treat people as greedy, lazy, and selfish, and do this high-powered incentives and monitoring and scrutiny and don't trust people, you drag people down. But you can create an environment in which people are brought up to being working together, to being cooperative. And we'll come to examples like that in a moment. But now I want to turn to one other really important bad idea that was introduced along with this travesty of human nature that we were greedy, lazy, and selfish. And so the other really bad idea was the idea that if you found a smart enough person, they understood fully how the world worked, how the world of the firm or the world of the business worked. And so all you needed to do was find the smartest guy in the country and make them the chief executive. Right? So find the smartest guy and put them in a position of commander-in-chief. There they are, and they're pulling the levers of power, presiding over this horrible structure of monitored incentives. Right? And that turns out, again, to be a really bad idea. Why? Because of a concept called radical uncertainty. And radical uncertainty tells us that the world is infinitely complex. And as our purposes have become more and more ambitious, the world we live in has got more and more complex. And so very often we have purposes which nobody knows how to achieve. And that is actually an existential state of mankind. Let's go back to evolution for a moment. Genetically, they're identical to the humans of 100,000 years ago. And let me compare us to another mammal, a squirrel. They're genetically identical to the squirrels of 100,000 years ago. Right? So if you want to understand the life of a squirrel 100,000 years ago, just look at a squirrel now. It's the same. Right? Squirrels are quite smart. They store nuts for the future. They jump around trees, right? All things that I can't do. Right? But it's never occurred to a squirrel in 100,000 years, is there a better way of living than storing nuts and jumping around trees? And now let's apply to humans. Right? Think of a human 100,000 years ago and the life they lived. It was absolutely nothing like modern life. Nothing like it at all. And yet genetically we're the same. And that's because humans have got a very distinctive feature as well as being very pro-social. We're very imaginative and creative. And so 100,000 years ago, people started to think, is there a better way of life than running around gathering food? And eventually they invented agriculture. And then they thought, is there a better way of life than just plowing a bit of land? Yeah? And we invented industry. Yeah? And we've kept on thinking of ways of living better and then being creative and trying to achieve them. But of course, it's much easier to come up with dreams of how life could be better. Right? At the moment, we dream, my kids dream of flying cars. You know, they want a flying car. Now, their grandchildren will probably have flying cars. Right? They'll come because young people will start to develop the technologies. They'll be creative. And that is the distinctive world of humans. We're always trying to achieve purposes that we don't know how to achieve, but being creative. That is the real genius of human beings. And that is the capacity that a good firm harnesses. Any firm in South Korea today is doing very different things from what it did 30 years ago. I'm sure of that. And how has that happened? It's happened because teams of people in the firm have come up with new ideas. And so what does a chief executive need to do? They are a commander-in-chief, but they actually need to develop a different skill. And that different skill really calls for different attributes. And that skill is not to be the commander-in-chief pulling levers, saying, do this, do that, I know best. It's being a communicator-in-chief. Now, a communicator-in-chief sets common purposes and then devolves the power of decision to teams within the firm. So, the communicator-in-chief needs to be a good communicator. But it's not just that you need to say the right things, you need to win trust. Any chief executive is heard, they've got a loud voice. But that doesn't mean that they're actually listened to. Right? And so a bragging, bossy chief executive who gets out of the corporate jet and says, you do this, is not going to be listened to, right? And so humans have developed, and they're the only species that has developed this, a different type of leadership. That bragging, bossy type is called dominance, and it's shared with all other species of mammal, dominance. And if you think hard enough, you can think of one or two political leaders like that, right? But there's a different style, which is this communicator style, winning trust of the group. And those people tend to be modest, self-sacrificing, often self-deprecating, often have a sense of humor, right? They mock themselves sometimes, right? And they win trust by saying we and meaning it, because they've adopted a lifestyle which is not so radically different from their employees that when they say we, people laugh. So instead of getting out of the corporate jet and saying we, you wear the same clothes as the workforce, and you eat in the same canteen as the workforce, and you say we. And then what does that chief executive who's trusted do? They set these common purposes, devolve power to teams, and then having devolved that power, they let these different teams experiment in parallel. So you get very rapid learning in the firm. And then the good chief executive brings that knowledge back up and shares it across the firm. And the secret of our success, which was the title of Joe Heinrich's book, the evolutionary biologist at Harvard, the secret of our success is that we're very good at copying success. Again, that's distinctive. Other mammals can't do it. There's a wonderful experiment with 3-year-old kids and 3-year-old chimpanzees. And the 3-year-old chimpanzees are just as good at solving little problems, putting shapes into holes, as the 3-year-old kids. The 3-year-old kids are no smarter than the 3-year-old chimps. But when one kid finds out how to do it, all the other kids imitate fast. And the chimps don't do that. The secret of human success is rapid learning from others in a group. And so a good chief executive builds a company structure in which that is possible. So it sets common purposes. The teams then experiment in parallel. They do their own things. They have the agency in the team to do it, And then the information is shared across the company and spreads. That's the secret of our success. And it works. In The Future of Capitalism, I described the struggle between Toyota and General Motors for success in the American car market. And Toyota had no advantages. It was a much smaller company, much less profitable, much further away from the American market. So it had no advantages except one, which is that its executives ran the company in that spirit of building trust in the workforce. And because of that, Toyota was able to devolve a key decision, which was quality control. They devolved it to the workers on the production line. It was their job individually to spot faults. And if they spotted a fault, they pulled a cord and the entire line stopped. It cost $10,000 a minute to stop that line. But for Toyota, faults were treasures. If you could spot them on the line, you could eradicate them. And General Motors couldn't do that. We know all about this because General Motors started as the most profitable company that had ever existed. By 2009, it was bankrupt. And we know why. General Motors was killed by Toyota, and it was killed because General Motors could not replicate the Toyota system of quality control. They couldn't do it because their workforce hated the management. So instead of being communicators in chief, they'd been commanders in chief, and it broke the company. We get the same spirit of cooperation between firms as well as within firms. So let's look at the battle between Boeing and Airbus. Now, Boeing is one company. Airbus is a cooperation between a lot of companies all across Europe. Airbus has now defeated Boeing. Boeing did this high-powered incentives, and if you remember, what the workforce used the incentives to do was bypass the safety controls. And so recently, Boeing's started falling out of the sky. The new Boeing Dreamliner turned out to be completely unsafe. And so Boeing has now destroyed its reputation, destroyed its market. Meanwhile, Airbus is now dominating the world airline market. And so that's cooperation between firms, the same spirit of cooperation as Toyota had within its firm. So finally, flexibility. Sometimes you need commander-in-chief powers, sometimes you need communicator-in-chief powers. And a good chief executive builds a structure of management where you can easily switch from one to the other. Let me give you two examples. One is from communicator-in-chief to becoming commander-in-chief. Now, I don't know what's happening in the retail sector in South Korea, but I do know what's happening to it in Britain, and that is an awful lot of retail stores are having to close because so much of business has shifted to online purchases. And so stores just don't need as many shops around the country as they used to. Now, you can't devolve the decision as to which shops should close to the people working in those shops. It's just completely unreasonable to expect a team of people who've been running a shop together for 30 years to say, we will sacrifice ourselves on behalf of the company, we will close this shop. Everybody can see that's an unreasonable thing to put on people. And so who should take that decision? And it needs to be taken pretty fast because a lot of these retail chains are on the edge of bankruptcy. That's where, having built trust, a good communicator-in-chief can say, this decision has to be taken by me, and it has to be taken by me now, and these are the stores that are going to close, and this is where I'm choosing them. Right? So that's an example of a communicator-in-chief switching to being a commander-in-chief. Let's have a look at it the other way around. A commander-in-chief switching to be a communicator-in-chief. And the example I'm going to draw is management in the Israeli Air Force. So the Israeli Air Force is generally understood to be the most successful, most formidable air force in the whole world. And here's what happens when Israeli jets are in combat. So you imagine 4 or 5 Israeli jets in the air facing an enemy, right? A set of enemy jets. And there'll always be one pilot who's got the best view of the situation. Now, it might be the wing commander in charge of the group, or it might not. And the Israeli Air Force command switches instantly to whoever's got the best view. And so the wing commander has got all those powers of commander-in-chief, but he gives them up. Whoever's got the best view becomes commander-in-chief. So all the commander has to do is become a communicator-in-chief and say, you're in charge. So, flexibility. So we've covered 3 big points. We've covered that we don't want incentive systems designed on greedy, lazy, and selfish. We've covered the point that we're very innovative, and so we need to communicate purposes and then devolve our power of experiment and agency to teams within a firm rather than have a commander-in-chief. And we've looked at this flexibility so that we can switch between being a commander-in-chief and being a communicator-in-chief. So let me return finally to the 4 tasks that a human resource department has to set. And the first is, what is a good chief executive? What sort of chief executive should you be headhunting? Yeah? And the answer given by the business schools for the last 30 years is, find the smartest guy, right? And we can all think of a president who told us how smart he was, right? Well, that's not a good way to select a chief executive. You want a chief executive who can lead by example and win the trust of the workforce. So, yes, the guy needs to know what he's doing. He needs to be capable of being a commander-in-chief, but the more difficult characteristics are to be a good communicator-in-chief. And so to be modest, to be able to communicate a sense of purpose to people, and to be willing to walk the talk, to live in a way, in a style that enables the communicator to say we, and actually be listened to. So that's the criteria that we now should be searching for a good chief executive. Somebody who's a good communicator-in-chief, able to win the trust of the workforce. Next, what are the criteria for promotion? Now, again, do we want the smartest guy in the room, the smartest guy in the firm, right? Remember, what we're really trying to build is a lot of cooperative teams. And so what we're really looking for in promotion is people who have won the respect of their peers. People who other people would say, yeah, yeah, they're the best for this. We can work with them. We'll follow their example in things. We'll listen to them. So it's an ability to win the respect of peers, right? And to have good communication skills amongst peers. And one of the things that we know from very recent research in Switzerland has some formidably good companies, is that a very good practice is peer-to-peer evaluation. So creating situations where a team talks amongst itself about how people are contributing, each person is contributing to a purpose. So instead of scrutiny from above, it's self-scrutiny within a team. And that turns out to be very good at setting new purposes quite rapidly. So the chief executive communicates the purpose, and then the people in the team talk about how they are each trying to achieve that purpose. So that's peer-to-peer discussion rather than top-down scrutiny. So that was criteria for promotion. We want people who are actually able to work win the respect of their peers. The next is, what is a good reward system? And a good reward system, I think, is not what Bear Stearns was doing, the very high-powered incentives, the big bonus for getting the deal, a bonus won by an individual. What we really want to be rewarding are teams that have proved to be very good at cooperating within the team and innovating. And so rewarding successful teams is a very good way of going about things. Again, let me give you one practical example. And this comes from India. India, about 20 years ago, opened up to imports of cars. And they knew that they'd be facing competition from Japanese and Korean cars. And they knew that the cars they were building in India were actually models designed in Britain in the 1950s. And so when faced with a choice between a 1950s British car or a 2000 East Asian car, there would just be no contest. People would buy the imported car, not the Indian car. And so this firm making cars decided to start with one component of the car, and that was the car seat. And so they imported a car from, I forget whether it was from Korea or Japan, but they imported a car and they took the seat out and they went to a warehouse alongside the factory and they put the seat into that warehouse. And then they got their team that was making the seats for those 1950s British cars. And they showed them that much, much superior seat. And they said, you've got 6 months to work out how to make it. You're the team that makes a seat for a car. Learn how to make that a seat that looks like that. Right? You can have whatever resources you need, and you've got 6 months to do it. Now, 6 months later, they'd done it. They'd got a seat that looked a respectable comparison with an East Asian car seat. And what happened then? Then they opened that warehouse and the seat to all the other workers in the car firm. and they said, this team has done it. Now you're going to have to do that with each of the components for which you're responsible. But this team has done it. Learn from them how they learned. You won't be making car seats, you'll be making some other component that you make already, and we'll show you the competition. But they've done it. Now, first of all, think how that team felt at that moment, right? They were really proud, right? They had become the vanguard in the firm. They had led the way, right? And so there was a huge reward of esteem and pride. They were going to teach everybody else how to learn, right? And that's how that Indian car firm turned itself round and managed to survive when the trade restrictions came down. Right? So the reward system there was the reward to a team. And a lot of the reward was just respect from everybody else. They were showcased, you know? So you don't need to do this sort of Bear Stearns very high-powered individual incentives. You need team-based incentives. And your reward system, differentiating the senior from the junior, needs to be fairly shallow, because the senior people need to be able to say we to the junior people, and the junior people need to hear that we and not laugh derisively and say, you say we, but you're living in a different world from us. Right? So fairly flat, fairly shallow reward system. And then finally, let's get back to recruitment. And there are a few things that we now know from research. One is that people are going to have to, through their careers, develop a lot of new skills. And so it's good to get people who have an appetite for deepening their skills. People who are ambitious not to become chief executive as a prize, but who want to deepen their skills so that they will build new capabilities. And so an appetite for skill development, for training, for becoming better at what you're doing. That's one thing that turns out to be quite a good thing to look for in recruitment. A second thing is curiosity, creativity. And the third thing is being a team player. The people who are really greedy, lazy, and selfish are a menace in a firm, not an asset. Now, let me close with a final message which returns me to where I started. And that is young people in their 20s in Korea are pretty anxious. They're not confident in the future. They see a life of stress. And that is the result of an environment which treats them as greedy, lazy, and selfish. And so they're stressed because they're chasing these high-powered incentives. They're stressed because they're monitored. And we need to build a better world in which their anxieties go down, partly because they're trusted, partly because they've got the agency of being in teams, partly because they're working to a purpose that the chief executive, somebody they trust, has inspired in them. This is what we're trying to do in this firm. Huh? And finally, a lifestyle which doesn't reduce them to anxious wrecks, right? And the test of that is that they're happy enough to contemplate having children. And finally, there are quite a lot of things that a firm can do to signal that it's a good environment in which couples can have children. You can provide nursery care within the firm and that sort of thing. And that's it's not just a good thing to do, but it's a signal that you see a lifestyle in your firm as being compatible with bringing up a family. Now, the sort of people that will attract are the people who want to make a lifetime in the firm, not the people who are just greedy for themselves. And in doing that, the human resource departments across Korea will also be building a better future for the whole country. So on that note, I'm going to close for now. And Jeroen, I'll be very interested to hear what you think of it, what questions you've got.
So, well, thank you so much for your talk. And we actually received a number of questions from Korean audience in July. So yeah, if you're ready, I'm going to start with the first question. So the first question is that since the outbreak of COVID-19, individualism and selfishness are getting more widespread as non-contact interactions have become more common. So motivating people or managing performances have also become very, very difficult. The younger generation tends to dislike being united to achieve a common goal, and the epidemic seems to have reinforced this kind of attitude. So do you think, can education help people try to understand others and the community before themselves?
Okay, so let me challenge that a bit. COVID has produced very different responses in different countries. And let me contrast a really successful response and a rather less successful response. So within Europe, one country stands out as by far the most successful, and that is Denmark. Denmark has had both the lowest mortality rate from COVID in Europe and the lowest economic hit from COVID. So it wasn't a trade-off, do we protect the economy or do we protect people? Denmark managed to do both. And how did it do it? It did it because it had a very good prime minister who was a very modest person. I know her, Mette Frederiksen. She's a single mother, not a whole lot of education, to be honest, but she is able to say "we" to the Danish population, and Danes know that she means we. She's one of them. She's an ordinary person. And so she's become a very good communicator in chief. Now, she didn't know any more than the rest of us about COVID, probably rather less than most, you know. And of course, COVID was an example of radical uncertainty. Nobody really knew what to do. But there were some things that struck her as pretty obvious. And that was, this was something that was contagious. So it was a responsibility of everybody in Denmark to protect their neighbor from the disease. Now, it was quite a big asymmetry between the old and the young, because it was people like me who were dying, and the young people were pretty safe. Even if they caught it, they didn't, the death rate was very low. So it wasn't literally the case that everybody had to protect everybody. It was that the young had to protect the old, but the old needed to do their duty and stay out of the way of the young. If the old insisted on just going about their activities as normal, young people wouldn't be able to get on with their lives, and the economy would close. And so Mette Frederiksen said to the Danish population, "We must all protect our neighbours. If you're an old guy like Paul there, stay out of the way of young people so that they can get on with their lives. If you're a young person with children, don't let your children kill granny by running up and kissing her, right? And so every Dane became morally responsible. They were made morally responsible. Now, Denmark had done that time and time again, and so people were quite willing to take on this new responsibility of protect your neighbor. And that meant different things to different people, depending on the context. But it worked. The disease just didn't spread in Denmark because people were very careful not to give the disease to anybody else. Now let me go across the Atlantic to America. March 2000, when the disease first arrived in America, people were first aware of it. And what happened? What did people do in America? Well, for 30 years, people have been living in a society in which the big business organizations, and for that matter, the government, had dragged everybody down to being like my cat, greedy, lazy, and selfish. And so people had been dragged into habits of severe individualism. And so what did people do in March 2000 when COVID arrived? They formed long queues outside gun shops. So it was less a story of protect your neighbor than shoot your neighbor. But that turns out not to be a terribly good strategy against COVID, shoot your neighbor. So we've got very different responses in different societies, depending on whether the society was led into habits of being cooperative, caring about each other, and everybody being morally responsible, morally load-bearing. Or, as in America, whether you were led by a bragging commander-in-chief who was not trusted by very many people, and people have been habituated into selfishness. So COVID is an example of where the very nature of contagion means that the sensible thing is for us to cooperate. And in some societies that happened, and in others, the opposite happened. So COVID turns out to be an amplifier of the sort of society you've got. Now, with young people, there's a disturbing culture around the world of individualism, which is showing itself up in resistance to vaccines. And again, the responses are very different in different parts of the world. So in France, which is very top-down commander-in-chief, people are ordered to get a vaccine. I think probably a better approach is to explain to people why they've actually got a moral responsibility to get a vaccine. And don't be a danger to other people. You don't have a moral right to kill people, even inadvertently. And so not getting a vaccination and going around meeting people, you are potentially killing other people. And that isn't a fundamental human right. It's a fundamental irresponsibility. So young people need to be presented with the tough reality of moral responsibility.
Okay, that was very interesting. So the second question I got from the audience is a quite broad question. So the last thing people want in an organization is confrontation with their colleagues. How do you respond to the logic or opinion supported by the majority? And the standards of ethics are different for each individual, and people often question themselves if their ethical standards are wrong or right. So from your opinion, are there good ethical standards and wrong ethical standards?
What I think we need to avoid is the notion that there's one set of moral standards which invariably happens to be my moral standards, which other people need to be forced to adopt. Right? If we look at the history of moral standards, we see that they differ between different societies and they change from one century to the next. And so it seems to be very unlikely that the moral standards of young people in the University of Michigan in 2021 are the first time in the world that we've arrived at the proper moral standards for everybody everywhere, right? They may or may not be the right moral standards for the students in Michigan University, but they don't have a right to try and inflict those moral standards on others. So we need, yes, there's always a pressure to conform to the moral standards of a majority, but it's always important to temper that by recognizing that these standards are very, very unlikely to be moral absolutes. It is entirely legitimate to question the moral standards of the group if you think differently. And that's very good. That's why diversity in a group can be helpful. Innovation depends upon people coming up with new ideas. But the spirit in which those different ideas need to be presented is not a spirit of I am superior to you, but here's a different way of looking at things, which may be of interest to you. Try and understand why each of you thinks differently. And so the right technique for that is what's called dialogue. Dialogue has very clear rules of conduct. Dialogue starts from mutual respect and trying to understand the perspective of the other person. Right? And so the duty in dialogue is mutual respect and mutual learning. Very often, once that happens, what you get is convergence. People start to understand why other people think differently, and they start to move together. What we've got to avoid is the assertion of moral superiority. I am right, you are morally wrong. I am a saint and you are a villain. That sort of language has no place within a society or within a community. We're not saints, villains, and victims. We're all equally respected moral actors who are all somewhat in the dark because of radical uncertainty. None of us knows the ultimate truth. There is no utopia. We'll never get to it. Dialogue, backwards and forwards.
Yes, I agree. The dialogue as a rule of conduct for mutual respect sounds perfect, but it's sometimes hard. I think we really need to learn, agree to disagree, and accept each other rather than just saying that I'm right.
Think of dialogue as like a game of ping pong. Right? There are very clear rules to a game of ping pong. You're playing to win. You've got a bat, but you're not entitled to go around to the other side of the ping pong table and hit your opponent on the head with your bat. Right?
Yes.
So respect the rules of dialogue. Right?
That sounds like a good analogy. I'll think of the ping pong. So we take a little turn from our questions. So it's about the role of vocational training. So non-cognitive training is not popular in Korea. And then that was seen in your book that this is the case for all over the world. So what's the role of vocational trainings for adults, in your opinion?
So vocational training is enormously important. And the world leader here is Switzerland. Now, Switzerland is one of the highest income societies in the whole world. It's a hugely successful society. It's very devolved. Politically, it's extremely devolved. You know, there are 3 languages in Switzerland. That all Switzerland, you look at it, it's landlocked. It's got 3 different languages. It looks like a recipe for a nightmare. And instead, it's a hugely prosperous society. Right? It has one of the top 10 universities in the world, in Zurich. But 60% of Swiss children, Swiss young people, choose not to go to university. They prefer instead to take the vocational route. And the vocational route is as prestigious as the university route. You can end up running a Swiss bank through the vocational route instead of through the getting a degree at a university, right? And how is that vocational system run? It's run with a cooperation between government, and especially local government, and local firms. And so it's all decentralized to the level of a city, and the firms in that city jointly finance vocational training. It's pretty expensive because people are paid properly to go to undertake vocational training.
Wow.
Half of all the costs are paid by the local firms. And a lot of the training is done in the firm. Half the training is done in the firm, half the training is done in colleges. And the colleges are provided by local government. And the teaching is completely integrated. So what you learn in the college is relevant for the skills that you pick up whilst you're actually picking up a skill in the firm. And this is a hugely successful system in which vocational training, as I say, 60% of Swiss children do this. It's prestigious, and my word, because they're guaranteed a job by the firm makes very sure that they're productive. We had an au pair who chose to go back to vocational training. She had an offer at a university, but she preferred to go to the firm and go through this structure. And the firm she was working for was a world specialist in a particular technology. And she went into the firm on the marketing side. She was going to go around and market that technology. So the first week in the firm, she was put on a lathe to make that part that the firm manufactured. She stood alongside a man who made the part day after day, and she learned what he was doing. And she went on like that. By her 3rd year, she was sent to Chile in Latin America. Why? To learn Spanish. She'd been recruited because she already had good English after a year with us. And after a year in Chile, she had very good Spanish. And so she's now selling this equipment. And she knows everything about that equipment. She knows how it's made, she knows what it does, and she can speak to people in Spanish or English about it. And what she's trained to do is start by saying, what is the problem you face? This is the particular version of our equipment you will need. That is deep vocational training, and her firm will stay at the top globally for a long time to come. That is why vocational training is so useful. And if you're not doing it, you're missing something that has turned Switzerland into such an astonishingly prosperous society, despite all these handicaps. Landlocked, multilingual, and so on, you know.
Okay, so those were all the questions that I had for you. It was a very interesting and thought-provoking discussion and talk. And as a Korean in 20s, I must say thank you for saying that the future looks promising. Just hearing that from you gives us more confidence. Okay, so is there anything else that you would like to tell us today, or shall we call it a day?
Jerem, I think we've covered the territory, but it was a real pleasure to address such a big and important audience. Collectively, you're strategically very significant for the future of South Korea.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for your talk again.
You're very welcome.